Good afternoon. Thank you for staying around. Do I need to do something, or do my slides come up automatically? So today I'm going to be talking about Indigenous deaths associated with police contact in Australia. And as already been mentioned today, CEPS is starting a project on police use of force. During my time with CEPS, I've also been working mainly in the area of police integrity systems. And so this particular piece of work is really sort of an overlap of those two areas, the police use of force area and the police integrity area. I almost feel like I have to start with an apology of the fact that I'm not actually an Indigenous scholar. I'm not even an Australian. This is a really new area for me. So the position that I'm coming from is really from a sort of situational and behavioural perspective within looking at the cases of Indigenous deaths, rather than really going in depth into sort of Indigenous cultural issues. So as an overview for this particular presentation, I'll skip fairly briefly over the background and methodology for this piece of work and really concentrate on what the main themes are within the cases of Indigenous deaths in police custody in this sample. And because of the focus of the presentations today, I'll also say a little bit particularly about the cases that involved firearms. So the background for this research is really the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody in the late 1980s, with its findings in 1991. And that piece of work was focusing generally on custody, not just police custody, but all forms of custody. And 339 recommendations were reported. And since then, there's been various debate about the implementation of those recommendations, and particularly criticism over the lack of implementation or adequate implementation of those recommendations. So really, the aim of this piece of work was to explore cases of death of Indigenous people, particularly in police custody, because that's the focus of the work that we do in CEPS, and cases since that Royal Commission. So cases from 1992 onwards. And it's really about identifying patterns in those incidents. So as I said, we're really looking at situational aspects and behavioural aspects within those cases. We're using coroner's reports for this, so that we also have the addition of the coroner's recommendations within those cases to have a look at as well. So that gives us a bit more information to work with. And really, the point of this work is to identify points of potential prevention or intervention. So in terms of the data collection, as I said, it's based on coroner's reports. And it's coroner's reports of closed cases of deceased persons who have been identified as being of Indigenous origin. And these cases occurred between 1992 and 2008, which is when we conducted the data collection. We had a very inclusive definition of death in police custody, so it's not just within the custody environment, but it's also relating to the operations of arrest or attempts to detain the person in custody, and also possibly escaping from custody as well. So there's a whole range of issues around the custody. It's not just the custody environment itself. So we set out to collect these closed cases. We ended up with 98 cases since 1992. These were based, as I say, from the collecting the coroner's reports, and mostly these were from a system called the National Coroner's Information System, but we also had to go direct to the coroner's offices for some reports as well, some of the older reports. But I'd like to acknowledge the NCIS system and also the contribution of the Australian Institute of Criminology as well in helping us to identify relevant cases. So in terms of the data analysis, we started off looking through these coroner's reports and doing a content analysis of the individual behavioural and situational features of the event. So these are our variables. For this particular piece of analysis, I was interested in looking at the behavioural themes within the events. And so I've used something called smaller space analysis, which I'm not going to go into any detail, but it's just a way of looking at patterns within those variables and how frequently they're likely to co-occur, so we can start to build up themes within the data. And it also provides a picture, and I like pictures of data. So we can use that analysis to explore subsets within those variables, which are sort of themes, behavioural themes. And just so you know that it's not just me making it up, this is what an SSA looks like. I know that you can't read it, that's fine. I will go through it. It's basically all of these are variables, and we start to partition them into regions that make sense with our interpretation. And the 4 regions that I'll go through are pursuit, arrest, resist, and armed. I think that came up, I can't see it. There we go. And there's a mixture in there of police behaviours and the behaviours of the deceased person as well. So we're looking at both sides of the interaction. So if we take the pursuit theme first, look at that. Quite impressed with my PowerPoint skills. So the pursuit theme, the behaviours of the deceased, is usually that so ATD is attempt to detain. This was because of theft-related behaviour or driving-related behaviour. And on initial contact, that's IC, initial contact, with the police, they tended to flee straight away. In terms of what the police did, the police on initial contact pursued. There was some communications between the police in the police car with their sort of central communications, put the lights, the siren on. So you've got these sort of general, quite obvious pursuit-related behaviours. And that's a sort of very distinct theme down the bottom. So the next theme of arrest, we have the deceased on initial contact typically being intoxicated, being quite compliant with the police on initial contact, and the attempt to detain being usually for drunk behaviour, and quite often taken into what we call protective custody. So custody for their own protection because they're intoxicated. In terms of the police behaviour, the police quite often stopped the deceased person to help them. There was often physical contact, and that was physically directing them into a police car to take them into protective custody. In the resist theme, I have to go over here for this one, I can't see. In the resist theme, the deceased was usually detained because of some form of verbal aggression. In the initial contact, there was verbal aggression on the part of the deceased. They were often agitated, and occasionally there were also incidents of self-harm during that initial contact. So the police actually were called to incidents where the deceased person was already harming themselves. Attempt to detain was often for disorderly conduct. They often resisted the arrest. They resisted the arrest physically, and if they managed to break free, they would flee the scene. So the police in initial contact, there was usually verbal contact initially, but then also escalating to using a weapon. At the resist arrest stage, there was often a sort of attempt to manually restrain the person, often then with the use of handcuffs as well, so, typically physical force. Sometimes if the person did manage to flee during that resist arrest, they would obviously try and chase them down and eventually get them into the police car. So finally, the armed theme. So in this theme, you had the deceased was quite often under the influence of drugs. They were physically aggressive at the initial contact with the police. They often had a weapon, tried to hide or withdraw themselves from the scene. There was also some cases of siege incidents within this theme. The attempt to detain initially by the police was because of violent behaviour in quite a few of these cases. And there was also resisting arrest verbally, but also displaying a weapon as well at this resistance stage, advancing towards the police or another person with their weapon, using the weapon, and also possibly self-harming during that resisting arrest as well. The police would attempt to enter premises where the deceased did try to withdraw themselves or hide. They would also, in response, reach for their own weapon. In the resisting arrest, they would obviously respond verbally, but they would also display their own weapon, use their own weapon on occasion, and then finally actually provide medical assistance at the end of that case if the person had been injured during that phase. So now we've got those four basic themes. Really? Wow. 5 minutes, right. So now we've got those four basic themes. We looked at those four basic themes in terms of the actual cause of death and found that the pursuit theme was generally related to vehicle-related deaths, which isn't really that much of a surprise. So you have a pursuit that basically ends in a vehicle crash, and that's what causes the death. Sometimes the coroner ruled the cause of death as being the vehicle, and sometimes they ruled the cause of death as being accidental. The arrest theme, it was actually more related to natural causes. So where they were arrested, they were taken into custody and then died of natural causes whilst in custody. But there's also some cases, particularly of suicide there in custody as well. So suicide within the police watch house. The resist theme is mainly related to either police causing the death or, again, cases of suicide. But there are also some cases that were ruled as accidents and natural causes as well. So natural causes, there's at least one case where the deceased suffered a heart attack during resisting arrest. And then finally, the armed theme. Mainly related, again, to either suicide or the police causing the death, so police shootings or suicide, but also some, again, accidents as well. And in terms of the deceased person, so the pursuit, those people that were involved in these pursuits tended to be younger on average, tended not really to have a history of drug or alcohol use. Also tended not to have a history of physical health symptoms or problems, or a history of mental health problems, and typically not related to a call for service either. So the police would come across these people in the course of their duties. The arrest theme and the resist theme, the deceased people tended to be older. The arrest, both of those also, the deceased tended to have a history of drug or alcohol use. Arrest theme also related to physical health problems. So these are those cases where they're in custody and they tended to die of natural causes. They tended to have pre-existing health conditions. But they tended not to be under the influence of drugs during the incident. These cases did tend to involve a call for service, so a call from a member of the public to come out to that event because of some behaviour by the deceased. Finally, the armed theme. Armed theme did tend to be related to a history of drug or alcohol use, and also a history of mental health issues as well. Tended not to be under the influence of alcohol actually at the time of the incident, but did have a tendency to be under the influence of drugs at the time of the actual incident. And again, these did tend to be a call for service as well that the police were responding to. So, as I said, I would just concentrate a little bit on those cases involving a firearm for the purpose of this particular presentation. There actually weren't very many cases involving a firearm. Gunshot was the cause of death in only 10 cases in the sample. 3 of these were suicide, self-inflicted gunshot wounds, and 7 were actually police shootings. And of those 7, only 3 of those actually involved a firearm of any kind. 1 of those was real, 1 was a replica, and 1 was actually not even the deceased, but the deceased was involved in a struggle with somebody that had a firearm. There were 3 of the cases that the deceased had another weapon. This was like a sharp-edged weapon, a knife, in one case, an axe. And there was 1 case where the officer was actually in a position where they got caught and dragged by a car and used their firearm to save themselves from injury. So all but one of these gunshot cases were actually operations-related deaths, rather than custody deaths, obviously. One case, though, did happen post-custody, so a person actually escaped police custody and then committed suicide. But all cases in the sample where the deceased actually had a firearm, or had a firearm, ended with them dying by gunshot. There was one case where the person was suspected to have a firearm but didn't, and in that case the police used OC spray on the person, but they didn't actually have a firearm. So the coroner's findings and recommendations, particularly in relation to those few cases, actually not all of those cases had recommendations, so not much to work with. But generally, where the coroner made some kind of judgment, they typically said that the attempt to detain was justified. Only one case suggested any alternative actions, such as alternatives to custody, so issuing of a summons, for example. There wasn't any blaming of the officers in these cases, but the coroner did tend to highlight issues of time pressure and stress, and also inexperience of officers, basically facing them with unusual situations that led to potential deficiencies in their decision making in that time because of the stressful nature of the event. And the recommendations tended to be to police and to improve their training and their policies to aid with that decision making. As I say, there aren't many cases, so we can't do too much quantitative statistics with this, but just to show you that actually those cases that ended in a police shooting tended to be earlier in the period of the cases that we have, and really since the early 2000s we haven't had any police shootings, or certainly not in this data set up to 2008, any police shootings of Indigenous people. And actually, overall, the in-custody deaths are tending to be sort of relatively consistent over the time period, but we are a bit concerned about numbers of deaths in the police-related operations increasing over this period. So the main issues for the whole sample, drug and alcohol use was a main issue. I think something like 3/4 of the deceased were actually under the influence of alcohol at the time of the contact with the police. Obviously this can be linked to prior health conditions. It can mask current health conditions when they're taken into custody. It can also be related to aggressive behaviour and other criminal behaviour that brings them into contact with the police in the first instance. And it can also be related to driving offences, erratic behaviour, and also accidents as well. Crime and call for service obviously came up. As I said, a lot of these cases were actually a call for service by somebody in the community that they wanted the police to come out in response to something that the deceased person was doing at the time. And also mental health issues as well. As I said, some of these cases involved suicide and self-harm. But also, not that it's a mental health issue, but distrust of police as well. And also, and I think Danny might talk a little bit more about this in relation to police shootings, but a couple of cases where there possibly provoked shootings as well. So even statements like, "You're going to have to shoot me," in a sort of standoff between the deceased person and the police. So overall, in terms of the recommendations that we looked at, so the coroner's recommendations, there was a mixture of recommendations for external agencies and the police. Mainly recommendations were towards the police. Where an external agency was mentioned, it was for one of two roles. It was either providing some kind of oversight or monitoring of the police and what they're doing, or providing some kind of support service to them, such as providing alternatives to custody, or providing support, for example, for assessing people that come into the watch house, like medical assessments or mental health assessments. In terms of the police, It was mainly around improvements to policies, procedures, practices, that sort of thing, improvements to training, but also some recommendations around staffing and improved systems. So concluding comments. As I said, I'm not an Indigenous scholar, and so I looked at the literature around deaths in custody generally, as well as Indigenous deaths in custody, and actually found that a lot of the issues that are coming out in this particular sample also come out in samples of non-Indigenous people and non-Australian people as well. So looking at samples overseas of deaths in custody, in police custody, there's a lot of similar issues coming out. And also similar issues to the Royal Commission, and even similar recommendations to the Royal Commission as well. But at the same time, we have seen some change and some improvement. Some cases of suicide in custody have tended to decrease over this period, and particularly that's been stated to be improvements on cell design and removal of suicide points within cells. But obviously we are still concerned about operations deaths. So just as a final sort of point, I think really what this tells us is that police training and police policies really need to provide support to officers in terms of risk assessment and at all processes, all points throughout the process of contact with these people. And I've just drawn on a model here that's, it's a model of violent encounters and particularly the use of firearms in police shooting, but I think it applies here as well. So thinking about risk assessment in each of these stages, so the anticipation stage, the initial contact, the exchange of information, and the final decision, and that there are points of assessment at each of these stages where you can reassess the situation, think about what information you need, and making a decision accordingly at that point. But also what this lacks that is relevant to the current model is the stage of aftercare as well. And so the importance of assessment at custody as well, the importance of assessment of risk, and what responses and what monitoring is put in place when those persons are in custody. So thank you.